All right, let's pick up where we left off, covering the objectives in the Pen Test Plus curriculum. This time talking about physical penetration testing, which is every hacker's favorite pastime. How to social engineer your way through, or how to bypass locks, surveillance systems, and security barriers within reason. Don't get too crazy here. In terms of physical penetration testing, we're talking about getting to things, potentially, like you may need to get to things that aren't on the actual internet, right? The air-gapped systems could be challenging to get to through any means other than physical connections. So similarly, if there is a system connected to the internet, but it's appropriately hardened, the nice thing about physical access to a device is that ultimately you own the system you're connected to, because you have the ability to like modify the physical media that it's on, or pull the hard drives out, or do all the things. Again, based on what is within the scope of work for the engagement. So you can, like, firewalls become a thing of the past. If you're on the inside of the firewall, that's one of the problems with them. Again, damaging physical assets, very seldom included in the scope of a project. Although maybe putting a sticky note on something that says we got in and damaged this asset might be a little more legitimate. Perhaps borrowing an asset might be inside a scope, where you would walk out with one.
I can see that making a good sense to be habit, where you would note that, hey, we broke this, had this actually been like one, just so you could mark like, hey, we got access to this would be broken, were this an actual.
Yep, a good place for like photographic evidence of you with a hammer over top of the server, and we'd have broken this one, and we'd have broken this one, or we'd have stolen this one, and we'd have stolen that one. Never ever heard of a pen test where the pen testers were allowed to threaten or harm personnel, but is a thing essentially that you're defending against, so you will know if somebody can threaten or harm your personnel. And then this is probably the most common thing that happens in a physical penetration test, is somebody plants a rogue network device or a keyboard logger simulator thing, or any of those kind of things. So does something that sets the, creates a persistence in the network or in the organization. Very seldom do they hire people to go in and threaten or harm their personnel. It seems like a bad move. So as one prepares for the scope of this thing, start thinking about the legal and ethical constraints on your actions. That's huge. Like, if you're going to be doing anything that like involves breaking and entering, which is oftentimes what physical penetration testing comes down to, like, be 110% sure that you have the legal right to do that. And the hackers who broke into the wrong floor of the courthouse spring immediately to mind, right? They had authorization to work on I guess it was the city-controlled part of the building, but not the county-controlled part of the building, and essentially wound up breaking the law. Make sure you've got detailed descriptions of what it is you're going to be allowed to do before you do it. You potentially, if you are in a building, at night, after hours, people get a little antsy and might draw firearms and shoot bullets at you which is bad and potentially hazardous to your health. So, a good idea to make sure that if there are firearms on the premises, you're aware of that ahead of time and prepared for dealing with that. And then we're back to like Ocean's 11. So start preparing for your intrusion by performing visual reconnaissance, all of the open source intel we talked about, scoping out the joint, casing the joint as they called it in like 1940s movies. But now we can case the joint with like Google Earth and Google Street View and cameras that have 100x zoom lenses and all sorts of stuff. You can use a physical pen testing, social engineering sort of technique to get in. So piggybacking is the walking in with a group, bypassing the card readers. Most companies that have card readers have policies and training, hopefully, that that make sure that every single employee badges in as they come through. But if they don't, piggybacking or tailgating your way into an organization is an easy way to bypass all of the security measures that they put in place. I like to mention Marlboro country at this point. Most offices these days in Michigan, we have like 10 or 20 foot rule from smoking around buildings. So the smokers will go out to 10 or 20 feet away from the building, usually across the street or whatever, and then come back in after their cigarettes. And that place where you stand outside, that's Marlboro country. And following folks in or going out there and compromising your health a little bit and smoking a cigarette with the Marlboro country people is usually an easy way to do that sort of thing. Shoulder surfing is super easy these days. In my physical classrooms, I'll often like leave my phone in a shirt pocket and just leave it on record and then walk around as students log in and say, oh, did you log into your computer for you? And type in the password and then play that video back in slow-mo and say, is that a C? Not very nice to do to people, but it gives you the the importance of how easy it is to get passwords from folks. In fact, there's been research on going through and calculating like keystroke timing and keystroke sounds, so that even setting a phone next to somebody while they log in potentially could compromise the logins. I'm always concerned about like all the logging into systems I do. I really got to break down and just put key-based authentication on my boxes, but because I record them, they're on the internet, you can play those back and figure it out. And then dumpster diving, you're not really a hacker until you've gone dumpster diving, but looking for old computers and electronic devices. If you know how an organization disposes of their systems, they if they don't drop them off with like a reputable recycler who actually cleans them out, that's potentially a way to like find a lot of old documents on like hard drives that have been decommissioned. So that's the social engineering piece. Then there's the just breaking in piece. There's a bunch of great resources out there for picking locks. There is a whole like lock sport community that's all about picking locks and breaking into systems.
It's a very fun and useful hobby.
There you go. It keeps you out of trouble. You can, these days, if you don't have the ability and wherewithal to pick locks, usually like there are plenty of key printing services online now that will, if you send them a picture of the key, they will send you back a key, which makes picking the lock just that much easier. So if you see at Tribune, everybody had a habit of leaving their keys dangling inside of their door locks. So they'd go to work and they'd unlock their offices and they'd leave their keys just hanging there. And you could get a picture of, I guess, everything but the door lock by doing that because it was in there. There's a bunch of ways that you can, bypass a lock. A piece of tape over the latch will work great. Most locks are smart enough not to have a place where you can slide a credit card through anymore, but that trick used to work. Propping over, taping over the latch, dropping a brick between or any object between the door and the jamb so that it doesn't shut all the way. We saw a sensor used to make a lock fail. by disengaging for security. But be like water, you know, do the Bruce Lee thing. There's no reason to mess around with a lock if you can get somebody to let you in, or if you can tape off the latch or what have you.
There's also, I don't know, I guess we covered under the key for tools, so it'd be like some of the ones like a bump key.
Yeah, where you just kind of like rake it across the ends. Or those guns.
There's a rake pick that does that, and that's sort of how the gun works. I guess it also kind of works like a bump key. Bump key would be filed down to the smallest points on each of the pins settings, and then usually a soft spacer would be put against the base of the key, usually something rubber like a gasket of some kind, and then that'd be pushed up against the lock, and as you tap it, it's going to go forward, push each of the pins, it's going to launch them upwards with a sudden motion, and then the bump key will spring back into the original position just behind the pins because of the spacer, and so you do that a couple of times, and as the pins keep getting shot up, they catch into their correct positions.
And then you just...
Yeah, it is. You just put a light pressure on the key and just, usually like a screwdriver handle or something, just tapping behind it a few times and then click.
And the next thing you know, you're inside the building. So surveillance systems can be tricky. It is expensive depending on like the size of the organization, the size of the facility in question. Potentially expensive to camera the whole thing. So oftentimes, if you take some time and map things out, you can figure out where gaps exist inside of there. The other thing is like security cameras are only as good as the people looking at them. And if you've ever had to figure out who stole the burrito out of the break room that gets a ton of traffic over a weekend, you'll realize that sometimes it's just not worth looking at, even in fast forward, 48 hours of a facility that has 24 access to it. But it takes work. The whole Mirai botnet, one of the big problems with it was all these cheap IP camera systems that go up that nobody really sat down and bothered to secure. And actually knowing personally some installers of these types of systems, they're not always installed by computer experts, but usually by like physical plant experts, people who are good at like running cables and stuff, and maybe not so expert at putting appropriate passwords in place and keeping systems up to date. So oftentimes they're a potential hole in the network security by themselves. And then depending on how the motion sensor works, there's a bunch of different ways to defeat them, like spraying aerosols at them and that kind of stuff, in order to either trick them on or not let them trick on. And then, I mean, some of this becomes like, how parkour are you? If you're talking about fences and walls, usually not too hard to find a gap or a way to get over them if you are spry and willing to put in a little work. Like a 3 or 4 foot barrier, you know, that's a polite request, right? It's saying, please don't come into our facility. It's not really stopping people. If we're talking like an 8 foot high fence with barbed wire on it, now you're getting a little more serious. Potentially, although you might not find a pen test that would allow you to do this, you could definitely cut through most chain link fence with a large pair of bolt cutters without too much difficulty. The ones that are anti-crash rated usually involve things called bollards. So big, if you've ever seen the big cement posts that are in front of buildings, or sometimes they're decorative, like the Target on Alpine Avenue has these big giant red target-shaped walls.
Yeah, sometimes they're just, I've seen the ones at Target, so they're just like, it's a big ball, essentially, made out of concrete.
Right, and if you hit a ball made of concrete in a vehicle, that vehicle will stop. So again, oftentimes, if you can just find a place that's not well lit, not well accessed, you can find your way into an organization pretty quickly. Inside of a building too, you'll find like oftentimes offices have like really serious door locks on them, and they have like security cameras and stuff, and then they'll like think that they're secure, but they'll forget that drop ceiling exists. And so I have more than once got into an office by taking a ladder along with me and lifting the drop ceiling on one side and the drop ceiling on the other side, and just hopping right over the wall. So even inside buildings, people don't realize that is a thing. So there you go. That's how to social engineer. So impersonating people online, and how to get into organizations like going through entryways or surveillance systems or humans.